Is Greece squandering money for refugees? We investigate whether funds meant for humanitarian aid have been misspent. I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmakers are the allegations of fraud at Greek refugee camps. As one journalist described the Moria refugee camp, it was supposed to look like a Hilton. Instead, it's a national shame. The area on the Greek island of Lesbos is notoriously overcrowded, rampant with crime, and lacks basic services such as adequate running water. Why? Well, the Greek official in charge of registering refugees blew the whistle on what he calls the government's lack of due diligence, especially when awarding contracts to companies that provide catering and plumbing. $1.6 billion from the European Union may have been misspent. And as the EU's anti-fraud watchdog investigates, we decided to send our own journalist, Haider Abbasi, to the Moria camp. Here's what he found.
Greece is the front line for Europe's refugee crisis. At one point, tens of thousands of asylum seekers were arriving here every day. The country is overwhelmed. But the European Union has stepped in. From 2014 to 2020, the EU has made available $1.8 billion to Greece to help it manage the crisis. But now there are questions about how this money is being spent. This is Moria, Greece's largest and most notorious refugee camp on the island of Lesbos. The camp is overcrowded, dirty and dangerous. Food is a particular concern.
The food is not for a human. Smelling very old food. Sometimes people fight, even injured each other.
In this mobile phone video, refugees in Moria are throwing away food given to them in protest over its quality. Other refugees we spoke to in Lesbos complained of not having electricity or water and shelter with no heating. Moria is at the center of a scandal over the suspected misuse of EU funds meant for refugees. Catering companies and other service providers for the camp are accused of overcharging for contracts, and the suspicion is the contracts were awarded without going through the usual bidding process. Gabriel Serites is political editor of Philadelphios based in Athens. His newspaper wrote about the allegations related to Moria, and it accused former defense minister Panos Kamenos of giving lucrative contracts to close business associates. The day after the article was published, 3 journalists from Philadelphios were arrested for libel. They were released the same day. Kamenos denies the accusations and is now suing the newspaper for defamation.
And now, after all these years, we still have these pictures coming from Moria with children attempting suicide. A few days ago, a refugee at Evros said he wanted to kill himself because the food he has to eat is not fit for humans. This is the general picture. And on the other hand, you have $1.8 billion, which went where exactly?
The European Union's anti-fraud agency is now investigating Greece about how it spent money intended for refugees. This building is another example of how Greece hasn't properly used EU funds. In 2017, around $1.5 million was allocated to develop this building and several others to house unaccompanied refugee children. But none of them have been refurbished and they're all empty. I put these allegations to Greece's immigration minister.
The money Greece has received from the EU is about $900 million in the last 4 years. And this money, which hasn't only been used by the Greek state, but also by the UNHCR, has been spent on creating apartments for refugees in other facilities. I don't think it's fair to focus exclusively on the problems located in 2 reception centres and overlook what we have built in the other 32 facilities.
Karatepe is another camp for refugees, also on the island of Lesbos. But unlike Moria, Karatepe is run by the local government and not the immigration ministry. And it has a limit on the number of refugees it accepts. The refugees we spoke to here have no complaints about the food or shelter.
In Moria, you have to wait in food line 12 hours a day. Over here, you can do whatever you want. You're not bound to stand in food line, in toilet lines or anything.
We spoke to the deputy commander of the Moria camp and told him about the complaints refugees made over the food.
It is very good because it is tested and examined from let's say, from special committees, and they have 4 days per week they have meat. We ask their needs. No, actually no, and they take 2 and 3 times. No, on that I don't accept it.
Dimitris Vitsas insists his government hasn't wasted EU money meant for refugees, but he does accept that there are serious issues facing the Moria camp.
The official information that we have right now from the European Commission is that the investigations that it has carried out, by the way, the Greek government itself is also performing investigations, haven't resulted in any kind of squander or mismanagement of the funds. Of course, there have been formal allegations, the details of which we are not aware of, meaning that we have asked the European Commission what these allegations were, but they said the anti-fraud agency was now handling them. Any allegation will be examined by the Greek government, and in case anything comes out, which so far hasn't, it will be handed over to the Greek courts.
Refugees in Moria are already emotionally damaged by war. Psychologists there say the camp only worsens their trauma. One NGO says 30% of the people it assessed in Moria have attempted suicide. Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers, Athens, Greece.
Human rights groups are sounding the alarm in Brazil. Nearly 4 women are murdered every day because of their gender. A jealous boyfriend or a hostile family member is often the killer. And the crime typically happens in the victim's own home. The government tried to fight back in 2015 with tougher prison sentences. But in a country of 200 million people, there are only 74 shelters for female victims of domestic violence. So what's Brazil's new president going to do about this problem? Well, let's ask Bolsonaro supporter and entrepreneur Julio Moraes, who's also the CEO of the Public Administration Institute. With him is Flavia Carbonari, a violence prevention expert at the Brazil Forum for Public Safety, and Cheyenne Polimedio, Deputy Director of the Political Reform Program at the nonpartisan think tank New America. I thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Flavia, let me begin with you. Is Brazil an especially violent place for women?
Yes, absolutely. Brazil is a very violent country in general. We have almost 65,000 murders per year. And just in 2017, the latest report from the Brazil Forum on Public Safety showed that 4,500 women were murdered. So it's a very violent country, especially for women. We had over 60,000 rapes reported. So this number could be much higher, given that this is one of the types of crime that has more underreporting. And we had over 220,000 reports of domestic violence. So it's a very, very dangerous country for women specifically, but it's a dangerous country in general.
So, Cheyenne, for those who might say, well, in a country or society with very high crime rates and a lot of violence, yes, sexual violence is going to be folded into it, but maybe women are not being specifically targeted above and beyond that. Does that argument hold any weight?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. I think it's hard to be able to determine whether or not women are being particularly targeted. It is fair to say that Brazilian society is very patriarchal. So women have always been treated as second-class citizens, and it's always been much harder for women to be taken seriously in various realms of life. So whether or not they're being targeted specifically, I don't know if we have data on that, but it is a fair assessment to say that it's harder for them, yes.
Julio Moraes, why are so many women being killed every day in Brazil?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. I think the issue is more a cultural and educational issue than anything else. We have tough laws. I have to credit the previous administration. Lula passed the Maria da Penha law. Dilma has the upgrade on the rape law in 2009, and also created the Femicide law in 2015. But still, since 2007 to 2018, we have a growth, according to the United Nations, almost 30% of crime against women. So I think it's more like cultural and educational than like a big issue like in the law or something else.
Okay. Flavia, laws have been passed. The Maria Peña law that was mentioned of 2006, the law in 2015 that was mentioned, which had special penalties for domestic violence and beyond, and femicide, if you like. Yet this still continues, right? So is Julio right that this is even deeper than any law can legislate for?
I think it is deeper. I would agree with that. I think cultural norms is a huge part of it. We know that it's a huge driver of violence against women. And in Brazil and Latin America and in general, that's why we have such high rates of violence against women. But there are also other factors. So other factors of gender inequality also weigh into this, because the less rights that women have, the less empowered that they are, those are also drivers of violence against women. So it goes beyond, I think, just this patriarchal issues that we have in our society. But we have, we have less political representation. We have lower wages, less access to the labor market. So all these issues tend to make women more fragile in those situations and be more vulnerable to violence against them.
Yeah, Flavia.
But it's true that we have a strong legal framework.
Right. So, Flavia, with this new president, does it worry you that things will get worse?
I do worry. I think there are two main risks that I see. First, one very concrete related to a decree that was passed last month, loosening the access to arms. So I think that will put women in more dangers at homes. As you mentioned in the beginning of the show, actually half of the physical assault against women happen inside their homes, either by a partner, a parent, a stepfather. So if those people are able to have more access to arms, that will put women in more dangers. And several domestic violence survivors have spoken up against this measure. And I know that there's a discourse that people say that women could also benefit from having guns themselves to protect themselves. But that's very unlikely to happen. There's no evidence that shows that actually anyone having a gun at home will be safer, and let alone women if, half of their aggressors are inside their homes. So that's one thing that worries me. And the second, which I think is a broader issue, is related to the cultural norms that we were talking about in the beginning. So you can have stronger legislation to protect women that have already been victims. But if you don't work on the prevention side of it, these crimes will continue to happen. And when you have a discourse at the presidential level or during the campaign or at the ministry level that sort of emphasize some of the gender stereotypes that we had before and some sexist comments or misogynist comments, I think that can just reinforce the type of attitudes and social norms that we must change.
Okay, and Julio, I'm going to get a response from you in a minute, but I want to go to Cheyenne first. Cheyenne, do you agree with Flavia? Is she right to be concerned that some of these cultural norms are being exacerbated at the presidential level because of what the president has been saying on the campaign trail and since he took office?
Well, I think she's right to be concerned. I think that, the numbers don't lie in the sense that there's no real evidence that shows that having a gun at home makes one safer. I will say, however, though, that the narrative right now is very much skewed in the sense of the women who feel that they aren't going to be okay under this presidency and with, looser regulations around gun possession, but there is another counter narrative that's very powerful, that it's a lot of women who say that they actually feel safer. There's a lot of women who say, I am tired of walking around at night and being afraid that I'm going to be attacked, that I'm going to be raped, because I don't feel safe. And a lot of what the new president has promised is to increase safety. So she's right in the sense that the numbers don't lie, but at the same time, a lot of people, including women in Brazil, have gotten to a point where they don't know what else to do. So this is sort of a last resort for them, and a lot of them are saying, if the government can't protect me, I might as well protect myself.
That's interesting because, yes, okay, I might be willing to tolerate a misogynist comment or two for as long as you keep the streets safe, which keeps me safe, which is a fascinating reality on the ground. Julio, to the issue of the comments. We have Flavia mention some of the comments at the presidential level. We've been through this before, right? Bolsonaro saying that woman's too ugly for me to rape. Bolsonaro talking about gay people in derogatory terms. And when we look at the statistics, for example, especially gay women are especially targeted. When we look at guns, to the point made earlier, more than 50% of women that have been killed with guns. Here's a president who's pro-gun and is not the biggest fan of being diplomatic when talking about women or talking about minorities within the LGBT group, for example. Can you understand why people are concerned that things are only going to get worse?
Yes, and I think it's too unfortunate because it's too early in his administration, so we can judge him. What he said during his campaign is fulfill the laws. We have way too many laws to protect women, the LGBT, but even though for the last 10 years, the number is still growing, drastically growing. So I think if he fulfill the laws that we already have in place, that will bring more security to LGBT and the women's group too. But let me go back a little bit on educational discuss that we have previous. We also have a growth on students attacking teachers and professors. I think they should start like that. If you're not disciplined and show respect to a student, prepare them to be men and women that will be patriots and respectful to other people, the problem can continue to grow for years. Let's take back like 10 years ago when Lula passed the Maria da Penha, which toughened the law, but the law is still, but the crime rate still growing. So what's the issue to this day? You know what I'm saying? Okay. I think the point is, if we get like, if a woman and LGBT community can be safe with the gun law, they can protect themselves against women. Because usually most of those criminals or
but certainly, but the other argument, Julio, is to say that if somebody wants to shoot dead a woman, whether that be their girlfriend, ex-girlfriend, wife, whatever it might be, whatever the situation, it's made easier if guns are made more easily available, right? That's common logic.
Yes, I agree with you, but easy for them to protect themselves too. Women and LGBT community can also have guns too. They just need to apply and get granted to. You know what I'm saying? Like, so it's easy for them to protect. So otherwise, I think a man will think twice before I shoot a woman if you know the woman has a gun too. She can protect herself.
Okay, Flavia, do you buy that argument at all?
No, unfortunately, I don't. First of all, we all know that in order to be able to use a gun properly and defend yourself, that requires a lot of training. So I highly doubt that all the women, first of all, that will be able to access gun. Most of the women who are victims of violence in poor areas won't be able to access guns, and let alone training to be able to use it. So not only that, the fact that the gun might be found at home by their partners, for example, just may increase the risk of retaliation. So I think that's unfortunately that's not that wouldn't happen. And also, if I remember correctly, the latest survey that I saw on the support for this legislation in particular, that was back in December, done by Datafolha, it showed that 70% of women were not in favor of loosening gun restrictions. in Brazil. Of course, everybody wants to feel safer and to be safer, and that's the platform that Bolsonaro ran that, you know, made him gain so many votes. But in this regard, in specifically, I think, and the data shows that most women are not in favor of that, and they do think that they could be more vulnerable at their own homes also.
Yeah, this makes me want to have a gun control topic on Brazil, a specific segment on this in the future, because this is a fascinating debate in Brazil. I'm South African. I grew up in South Africa, and the debate is very similar, especially in a country with high crime rates. A lot of people are for it, a lot of people are against it, and they make compelling arguments both ways. Cheyenne, I want to talk about the issue of retaliation, because it was brought up by Flavia here. We've got the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. In their report, the Commission noted with concern that in most cases, the murdered women had previously denounced their aggressors, faced serious acts of domestic violence, or suffered previous attacks or attempted homicides, right? So is the lesson here that if you speak out, it makes you more of a target and you could end up dead?
Yes, it's a failure of the system. We read every other day in Brazilian media a story about a woman who was murdered, who had sought some sort of help from the authorities, who denounced her aggressor, who said, "I don't feel safe," and yet none of the precautionary measures were taken to make sure that she felt safe, that she was protected, or that the aggressor was put behind bars. So it's a failure of the system. A lot of things go into that. One of them is just a lack of capacity. So we have these specific stations, police stations around the country that are focused on women so that women feel safer going there and filing a complaint. There aren't enough of those. It's also a failure of a cultural failure, women not feeling safe in terms of really going to the authorities and telling them what's going on and making sure that what is happening to them is known. But it's also a failure of the law, right? If you go up there and you make a complaint about your aggressor, you shouldn't have to make a complaint 3-4 times for you to be taken seriously. You should be taken seriously on the first time. So there are a lot of things going into it that create just an overall failure that makes us see all these cases happening, even though women did try to make them stop.
Okay, well, it's been an important conversation to have, and I thank you all for taking the time. Julio, Flavia, and Cheyenne, thanks so much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Still to come, do Black Lives Matter if they're British? One MP says the UK is acting like they don't. As deportations resume, we ask if any lessons have been learned from the Windrush scandal. And Egyptian comedian Bassem Youssef talks to us about life in America and what it's like taking on the Trump administration. This week, the UK kicked out more than 24 people, putting them on a plane to Jamaica. The government initially said they were all rapists and murderers, but not everyone's convinced. They're the first deportations since last year's Windrush scandal. That's when it was discovered that 63 people who had lived almost all of their lives in Britain were wrongly forced to leave. It was such a disaster that the Home Minister was forced to resign. So, have deportations resumed because the government's now got its act together? Well, reforms have been promised and an investigation into the scandal occurred, but so far, nothing has changed. Natalie Perhonen has more.
Sees the arrival of more than 400 happy Jamaicans.
The first members of what's called the Windrush generation came to the UK from the Caribbean 70 years ago. They were British subjects invited to help rebuild the country after the Second World War. Many of the children who came with them didn't enter on their own passports. At the time, it wasn't an issue, but decades on, that missing paperwork has had profound consequences. The name Windrush has become synonymous with a government scandal.
Windrush, here to stay. Let's deport Theresa May.
Some members of the Windrush generation were wrongly classified as illegal immigrants. Some were taken to detention centres, and dozens were deported. Their plight has come back into the spotlight after the UK government hired a charter flight to deport people to Jamaica. The first of its kind since the Windrush scandal back in 2018, and before the findings have been handed down from the independent Windrush Lessons Learned review.
Before the review is even complete, why are you deporting people? We hear about deportation flights to Jamaica this week, when you have detained up to 50 black British residents and given them open window removal notice.
He mentions the deportations of foreign national offenders. This government, I think the information he referred to, if I've understood him correctly, is about a charter flight to Jamaica of foreign national offenders only. Every single one of them convicted of a serious crime.
The Home Office says 29 serious foreign criminals were flown to Jamaica, but that none of the people on the flight were British citizens or members of the Windrush generation. There are still concerns about these latest deportations. Last year, the government said 32 members of the Windrush generation who were labelled as foreign offenders may have been wrongly deported to Jamaica.
Why is it that still in this country, black lives matter less?
Yeah. A question that needs to be answered for the British Caribbean community. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to London now. Joining me now is journalist Richard Sudan, whose grandfather was a member of the Windrush generation. And Andre Walker is a journalist who covers the British Parliament and a former Conservative Party staffer. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Andre, let me start with you. Aren't you concerned that just like last year, the wrong people are getting deported and this is going to be a major screw-up again?
No, I'm not concerned at all. I think it's important that we enforce our immigration law. After all, one of the big problems that we've seen recently is the way that people have tried to conflate their desire to increase immigration in the UK with not enforcing the law. You know, ultimately, the people on this charter flight going back to Jamaica are people who've been convicted of serious criminal offences, and those are the people that we don't want in our country. I think that Britain's a
that's what everybody was told last year, right?
Place
Andre, that's what everybody was told last year, which caused the Home Secretary to resign. That's why there was a scandal, right? Because everybody trusted that the government's word was correct, that these are serious, really bad people and they're being sent very far away, but it turned out not to be true.
No, that was absolutely not the case last year. What happened with the Windrush generation was that some people, when they came into the country, were not given the correct documentation. Now, that is something that the government was unaware of. And so, obviously, when they came to check people's immigration documents last year, there were certain people who were put in a difficult situation. Now, what you're talking about here, and I appreciate that people have gone through a great deal of difficulty and a great deal of hardship, but the government estimates this is no more than 50 people. The people that we're talking about being deported now are people for whom there have been criminal convictions against them. We know there have been criminal convictions against them. That is well documented in court cases. So I think there is an important difference between those people who weren't supplied the proper documents 50 or 60 years ago and what's gone on today.
OK, Richard Sudan, these are people with criminal convictions. This is British law being enforced. No more, no less. What do you think?
Well, actually, I think if we're going to talk about law and criminality, we can talk about the Home Office in a moment. But actually, it's not fair to say that all of those being deported have been convicted of serious offences. You're talking about, in one instance, for example, a parking offence and other minor offences. And of course, you cannot separate the fate of these Jamaican nationals from their British family, because many of them have family here. They've been living here since they were kids. A lot of these people, some of whom, by the way, have had a temporary reprieve for a moment legally. Many of these people have had their children here, they've been working here, they've been here since they were children, and also they've actually had applications currently in the Home Office before they've been deported. So actually, if we want to talk about due process, legality, I think there are more questions to be sort of answered on the side of the Home Office rather than this group of individuals. I mean, criminality is just a sort of very simplistic way to look at this. The Home Office has actually not still finished its review of the initial Windrush scandal, which erupted 9 months ago. And here we are, the deportations were temporarily halted, and now the Home Office has actually decided to begin this round of deportations again. And a lot of people feel, frankly, it's open season on these kinds of communities with the current climate in Britain at the moment.
Andre, why not wait for the review and then you can implement better policies and all move forward together?
Well, I think that there's no issue with the policy, is there? The policy is that if you're an illegal migrant to the United Kingdom and you've got no reason to be in the United Kingdom, then you will be removed from the United Kingdom. That sounds entirely sensible. But look, I think it's important to remember that deportations take place all the time. We have a constant battle with illegal immigration. It's easier in the United Kingdom because we're an island than it is perhaps in other places. But nonetheless, we do have a problem with illegal immigrants. We estimate there's around 300,000 in the United Kingdom. I think it is important to enforce the law. And I think one of the sad things about this debate, and one of the things that is wrong, is the idea that any black person in the United Kingdom ought to be in some way feel victimised by this. It's absolutely not the case. Somebody who's an illegal migrant to the UK can be of any colour, race or ethnicity. Certainly we have a major problem in the United Kingdom with people from Eastern Europe, non-EU Eastern European countries using fake EU passports. That's something that we've got an issue with. The idea that we should allow people to remain in the United Kingdom because even though they're illegal migrants, just because they've had children in the United Kingdom, I think is manifestly unfair.
Andre?
Why should we be rewarding people who've come here illegally?
So when David Lammy, the Labour MP, accused the department of killing black people, what did you think about that?
Yeah, he went, well, I thought it was ridiculously shrill from a man who has made being shrill a hobby and a habit. Look, the idea that we should enforce the law is not an inappropriate idea. Now, I'm not against the idea of the British Parliament considering different immigration laws. In the past, we've had an amnesty on all illegal migrants. But the idea that you're not going to take any decision, you're not going to legitimise these people, what you're going to do is fail to enforce the law, seems to me to be a complete and total joke. Look, everybody who comes to the United Kingdom illegally has a backstory, a sob story, if you like. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't enforce the law. If you wish to change the law, change the law. But the idea that we should just simply ignore the law, I think is crazy.
Richard Sudan, this is not about targeting black Britons. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I didn't actually say it was about targeting black Britons, although disproportionately, that's the effect it's having. And actually, Andre Walker, he's correct in pointing out that also it's not just black immigrants or immigrant communities generally. You've got Eastern Europeans that have also been slung under the bus with this vile kind of political climate. But one other point I think needs addressing is the children of some of these migrants are British citizens. And actually it's worth noting that the Home Office has actually told some of the parents that they should be raising their children via Skype. Now, no one's suggesting that if you're a criminal, you shouldn't pay the penalty, but actually these custodial sentences have already been served. And so why on earth are these people being punished twice? And furthermore, why are their families being punished? Because their children are British citizens. And if we're just going to say, well, they don't have any rights, well then, what are we talking about? What makes a citizen? Do these children not have the right to have their access to their parents?
Hang on a second. Hang on, I think there are a couple of points there, and I think it's important to address. So first of all, yes, if you've served your time in prison or wherever, paid your fine or whatever it is, yes, you have been punished for your crime, and you should not be punished again. However, if you are, in addition to a criminal, also an illegal migrant, then you shouldn't be in the United Kingdom. Now, the issue with the children, I think, is one of these very difficult and intransigent problems. But I simply make the point that if you come to the United Kingdom illegally, then you should be removed from the United Kingdom. The fact that you then got married in the United Kingdom when you shouldn't have been here, and had children in the United Kingdom when you shouldn't have been here, I don't think necessarily should strengthen your case.
Or lived here for 20 years.
Think of all those people who have come here.
Well,
absolutely, lived here for 20 years illegally makes it worse than living here for 1 year illegally, in my view.
Andre, when you look at the pushback, there was a petition, for example, More than 91,000 people pushed back, signed an online petition supporting Twane Morgan and his deportation. He seems to have had a temporary reprieve. When we dig into the details of the man's story, he was a soldier in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Came back, suffered from severe PTSD, didn't get treatment for it, didn't quite have the help that he needed, beat someone up, went to jail for assault. He was in line for deportation. Of course, there's a deeper point to be made here. The British government was okay if he was being violent on their behalf in Iraq and Afghanistan, but if he beats someone up in the UK, he needs to be kicked out of the country. He seems to have got a temporary reprieve because there was pushback. You're saying all these people who are pushing back and championing the human rights of someone like him have no case. But we're seeing the fruits of it here because we have an individual case. You call it a sob story. Everybody has these stories because these people they've essentially been in the UK for decades.
That's right. Yeah, so of course that story is heartrending, as all of them are. I think the important point here is, if you wish to change the law and say that everybody who served in the British Army under any circumstance in any capacity automatically gets British citizenship, hey, I'm with you. I think that's a great idea. I think that's appropriate and that's something we should look into. But that's not the position at the moment. The problem with these 91,000 people is we have a law in this country about illegal migration and we have rules on deportation. Every single time anybody, hang on a second, every single person that is ever deported has a story, a backstory, right? If what we did was took no notice of the law whatsoever, then all you get is a free-for-all.
Isn't it convenient that this has been pushed through right now?
No, I think it's deeply inconvenient it's been pushed through right now. But the problem is, when you get illegal migrants, when you get illegal migrants coming to the UK constantly, then you have to have a constant process of deporting them. Look, this is not an easy or pleasant thing to do. Nonetheless, we are a country that is a target for illegal migrants, and we have to have a process of dealing with that. And the people, these 91,000 petitioners, essentially what they want is every single case to be an exception to the rule, i.e. you have no rules whatsoever. Well, we have to protect our public services, we have to protect our jobs, and we have to protect our border. And somebody has to do that job.
Richard?
Look, law is not the sole measure by which we should be really looking at this debate because, by the way, slavery used to be legal in this country. Yes, and I think if we just keep coming back to this same kind of argument about legality and law, fair enough. But slavery wasn't legal? Slavery wasn't legal, Andre. Is that what you said?
No, of course it wasn't legal.
Slavery
was ended. Slavery was ended when a High Court judgment said that slavery was not legal in this country, and actually all you were doing was illegally detaining people.
Slavery ended when No, it didn't actually. Slavery ended because
we're going to get into a semantic debate here, Andre. It was clearly legal until it was made illegal. It was clearly practiced and acceptable until it was practiced by the Crown.
No, hang on a second.
Hold on, it was practiced by the Crown, Andre. I mean, hang on.
There's no nuance here. This is the only level of debate you're going to get with Andre Walker. He's going to keep talking about legality and criminality. There's no nuance. There's no humanity with looking at these stories. He says tongue-in-cheek. He calls them sob stories.
Slavery was okay. Hold on. So Richard, I'm going to give you a point to. I'm going to give you a chance to wrap us up, Andre. Slavery, let's take the word legal away. Slavery was clearly allowed until it was not allowed, and let's park that off and put that aside. Richard Sudan, come in.
Well, if people wish to detain people illegally, then it's right that the High Court stepped in and stopped it.
Richard?
That seems sensible to me.
Look,
that is a case of enforcing the law.
Laws, we can talk about laws, we can talk about criminality. There are plenty of laws that are broken by the government. There are plenty of morally reprehensible policies pushed by the government. The idea that we're just looking at law and criminality as the sole measure in this debate. We need nuance in there. If we talk about laws being reformed, how do they get reformed? Well, the only reason some of these people that are being deported is because of public outcry, which shows you the disconnect between public policy and the government in this country, and how many ordinary people feel about the treatment of people who are citizens or have lived here for decades and should be citizens, or have citizens living here. there needs to be nuance in this debate. And actually, because of the otherization of immigrant communities over the last few years in particular, it's increasingly difficult to have a sensible, honest debate about immigration without all this kind of dog whistle, right-wing politics and hostility, which, you know, we're hearing all too much at the moment.
Andre, very finally, is this what you're doing? Is this dog whistle right-wing politics?
No, it's not. It's dog whistle left-wing politics. The truth of the matter is this country has laws in place about illegal immigration. We have processes in place. You know, the Windrush scandal shows that those processes aren't perfect, but fundamentally, if you come to the United Kingdom illegally and you commit a crime, congratulations, you're going home sooner or later, and that is the right position. That is the position that's been democratically agreed by our parliament and our government, and I think it ought to be enforced, and I'm glad to see that happening.
Andre Walker and Richard Sudan.
People are dying because of these wrongful deportations. Let's be clear about that. People are losing their lives. Families are being torn apart.
Rubbish.
You know,
Rubbish.
These are the facts, Andre. People are dying because they've been deported. Their lives have been torn apart. Families ripped apart. This is a reality. Parents are being told that, you know, the only option they have to raise their children now is over Skype. You know, this is the absolute hallmark of
we're
inhumane
enforcing the law.
Okay.
There is nothing.
Okay, gentlemen.
Inhumane policy.
Okay.
It's the law that you can't come here illegally.
Andre doesn't think it's inhumane. Richard believes it does. And I think I've got to wrap because we're out of time. Richard Sudan and Andre Walker, thanks for joining us here on The Newsmakers.
For decades, America propped up a who's who of military and theocratic dictators. They gave you what you wanted: oil, airfields, oil, security arrangements, oil. And let's not forget a few torture black sites.
Hey.
He's called the Egyptian Jon Stewart. Bassem Youssef's highly acclaimed comedy show took aim at the governments of Mubarak, Morsi and Sisi, and that led to a political backlash which forced him into exile. Now living in Los Angeles, Youssef is touring the United States with a stand-up act in English. He's using jokes to make fun of Middle Eastern politics while putting Donald Trump's White House in his crosshairs. And Bassem Youssef joins us now. Bassem, good to have you on The Newsmakers. Real pleasure having you on the show. I want to ask you a question that I've had.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've had this question in mind for a long, long time. Does it annoy you when they call you the Egyptian Jon Stewart?
No, it doesn't, because it gives reference for people here, especially in the United States, you know, to tell them like who the guy is based. So basically, in 3 words, they tell you exactly who I am, in reference to the people living here.
Is it harder to do comedy and satire in the US, in the English language, to a US audience?
Yeah, it is not about being in the US. It's as you said, it's doing it in a foreign language. If you It's one thing to talk or speak in a foreign language, but to do comedy in a foreign language, you need to rewire your brain, and it's about references, it's about timing, it's about pacing, speed, delivery. It's a whole new way to learn the language. So it has been hard, but it's been interesting, and I feel that it is as a kind of like reinventing my career for the third or fourth time.
Yeah, and sort of tapping into the culture and rewiring your brain. Maybe giving the example of Trevor Noah, I saw a lot of his stuff in South Africa as a South African. Now, within South Africa, a lot of his humor had that sort of raw quality to it because he was a son of the South African soil, right? So he was irritating the left wing, the right wing, conservatives, liberals, majorities, minorities, and so on. When I look at his comedy in the United States, as successful as he is, it's very much a left-wing critique of Trump or conservatives, right? It's different to what he did in South Africa. Are you relating to that in any way, that your comedy will have to be different in the US?
Well, my comedy is the same. I think most comedians, especially people who work in political satire, they do direct their comedy against conservatives or right-wing. I don't know, but I think like many of people back home kind of got annoyed of my comedy, but still mostly on the right wing. I don't know the history of Trevor Noah and knowing the people on the left wing, and why would they be annoyed by his comedy in South Africa? Maybe because he was talking about corruption. Maybe the left wing got to power and he criticized them. But basically back in Egypt, the left wing even didn't get a chance, so they were never in power. So it just happened that the 3 or 4 years that I was working in Egypt, as I was criticizing authority was either a right-wing military or a right-wing religious regime. So they didn't really like me. And also, most people on the conservative side, they're not very. Most people on the conservative side, they're not very funny.
Right. Are you disappointed, no matter how excited you may be in reinventing yourself and, you know, living a new life in the US? Are you disappointed that you're not back home doing what you were doing?
Well, nobody ever is happy about being uprooted from his own home, because what he tried to do is to use comedy in order to comment on the political scene. It's always sad, but I kind of reached some sort of a resolution with myself that I need to look forward and not look back. I will not let that break me. I will try to reinvent myself again and try to find some sort of success in this new country again. But of course, nobody ever liked to have to be targeted or being pushed away from his own country because he did his job as a comedian.
If you were there right now, would El Bernameg have a lot of material to work with?
Oh, yeah. There's absolutely no lack of material for El Bernameg back in Egypt. It has been a farce, basically. It's been very stupid and very crazy and hilarious. I can't say really it's hilarious, because you have to say that it's kind of like, it's not hilarious when people that you know get put in jail or get killed or get detained or get taken away from their homes. So I don't know how funny it could be, because the material is hilarious. The official statement is very comedic, but the impact on everyday life is not very funny.
Yeah. Just tap into culture a little bit. Within Arab culture, people love to mock their leaders. They love to make fun of their leaders. They love to make fun about, I don't know, how things don't work, how corrupt people are. Egypt, for example, I remember in the early 2000s and the mid-2000s, when I was there under Mubarak's regime, nearly every single person I met had a joke about Mubarak, right? And part of what made the joke so funny was that it was so subversive to make that joke in private with your friends in the coffee shops and so on. But no one would dare say that out loud in public. In public, you would show a sense of respect to the leader, no matter how crazy you thought he was, no matter how corrupt and useless he thought he was. Has that changed, or are people still being tremendously funny and brilliant and witty and satirical about their leaders, but only in private?
No, but that doesn't have to do anything with culture. This is human nature. You mock your leaders. The only difference is the state of freedom of expression. As you said, people did that against Mubarak in private because they were afraid to go to jail. Right? It never stopped. People mocking their leaders, their authority, never stopped any single day. The only difference that after the revolution 2011, there was a window for 3 or 4 years, where people can say what they had the illusion or the ability to mock them openly in the media. So what changed is not people's ability or tendency to mock their leaders. Is what changed is the status of freedom of expression. If you do it in private, and then when and in public, it's not out of respect, it's out of fear.
But has that changed? I mean, really, if we look at all the disappointment post-Arab Spring, we look at Tunisia as maybe the only semi-success story. Has it really changed?
What has changed? You mean the fact that people mock their leaders? Because that never changed. But what do you mean, what has changed?
Have people been open enough? Has there been enough freedom out there now? Has the political space opened enough for people to do it publicly?
No, absolutely. Of course not. If you're following what's happening in the Middle East, especially Egypt, of course not. the political space has become very constricted and very fearful.
Very finally, Bassem, what do you hope Americans could learn about the Arab world and the Middle East?
I hope that regular and average American know that whatever state of oppression in the Middle East is partly caused by the fact that many Western countries, including Europe, United States, France, Germany, that many of these dictators are empowered by Western democratic countries who supply weapons and supply logistic helps and basically turn the other way when those dictators are oppressing their people. You cannot continue supplying weapons and giving legitimacy to dictators just because they buy your weapons, and then when everything goes down to destruction and terrorism and cracking down on freedom of expression, when that happens, you can't say, oh my God, look at the Middle East, where did this come from? Everybody is complicit in this, and everybody has a role in this. So you cannot just like be sitting there in your democratic Western country and say like, we feel so sorry for what's happening in the Arab world. It has, most of those weapons in the Middle East has not been manufactured by Middle Eastern countries. They have been bought by Western democratic countries. And we really need to start talking about how the weapon industry in the West has been empowering many of these dictators in the Middle East.
Bassem Youssef, been a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.